Good evening. I'm Jason Calvert, and this is the Historytellers. Today we are investigating the events that surrounded the planting of English America from the years 1500 to 1733. As the 17th century dawned, scarcely 100 years after Columbus made landfall, the face of the New World had already been profoundly transformed. European crops and livestock had begun to alter the very landscape, touching off an ecological revolution that would reverberate for centuries to come. From Tierra del Fuego in the south to the Hudson Bay in the north, disease and armed conquest had horrifically disrupted the lives of many native peoples. By this time, several 100,000 enslaved Africans toiled on Caribbean and Brazilian sugar plantations. From Florida to New Mexico southward, most of the New World lay firmly within the grip of Imperial Spain. But North America in 1600 remained largely unexplored and effectively unclaimed by Europeans. Then, as if to herald the coming century of colonization and conflict in the northern continent, Spain, France, and England planted outposts in three distant corners of the continent within a 3-year span. The Spanish at Santa Fe in 1610, the French at Quebec in 1608, and, most importantly for the future United States, the English at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. England was late to the colonial roundup. In an era marked by religious war and infighting, it's actually amazing that a tiny island nation off Europe's western shores would come to project such enormous power and influence worldwide. Rebecca McMurran starts our show off this evening, discussing England's imperial stirrings.
Enormous power and influence are understatements to what Great Britain would become. However, at the start it was hard going. Feeble indeed were England's efforts in the 1500s to compete with the sprawling Spanish Empire. As Spain's ally in the first half of the century, England took little interest in establishing its own overseas colonies. Religious conflict, during the middle 1500s, disrupted England when in 1530, King Henry VIII broke with the Roman Catholic Church and subsequently launched the English Protestant Reformation. Catholics battled Protestants for decades, and the religious balance of power seesawed. But after the Protestant, Elizabeth, ascended to the English throne in 1558, Protestantism became dominant in England, and the rivalry with Catholic Spain intensified. Ireland, which has been under English rule since the 12th century, became an early scene of that rivalry. The Irish Catholics sought help from Spain to free them from Queen Elizabeth's rule. But Spanish aid never amounted to much. In the 1570s and 1580s, Elizabeth's troops crushed the Irish uprising with terrible ferocity, inflicting unspeakable atrocities upon the Irish people. The English crown confiscated Irish Catholic lands and gave them to new Protestant landlords from Scotland and England. This policy also planted the seeds of the centuries-old religious conflicts that persist in Ireland to the present day. Many English soldiers developed in Ireland a sneering contempt for the savage natives, an attitude that they brought with them to the New World. Reporting for the Historytellers, I'm Rebecca McMurran.
Thank you, Rebecca. More often than not, it's the common man that gets caught under the boot of religious and political tyranny. Sadly, this theme continues around the world, even today. However, from this turbulent era, a new force begins to emerge, and it's not led by a man, but rather, a woman. As our story continues, Queen Elizabeth begins to energize England and sends her people out to colonize and conquer new lands. Encouraged by Queen Elizabeth, English buccaneers swarmed out upon the shipping lanes. They sought to promote the twin goals of Protestantism and plunder, by seizing Spanish treasure ships and raiding Spanish settlements, even though England and Spain were technically at peace. The most famous of these pirates, or sea dogs as they were called, was Francis Drake. He plundered his way around the planet, returning in 1580 with his ship heavily ballasted with Spanish treasure. The venture netted massive profits for his financial backers, among whom in secret, was Queen Elizabeth. And defying Spanish protest, she brazenly knighted Drake on the deck of his ship. Raiding the slow-moving Spanish treasure ships was one thing, but starting a colony proved to be much harder. The bleak coast of Newfoundland was the scene of the first English attempt at colonization. This effort collapsed when its promoter, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, lost his life at sea in 1583, and with him, the dream of an English colony. However, his dream inspired his half-brother Sir Walter Raleigh to try again in a warmer area. Raleigh organized an expedition that first landed in 1585 on North Carolina's Roanoke Island, off the coast of Virginia. After several false starts, the hapless Roanoke colony mysteriously vanished, swallowed up by the wilderness. These pathetic English failures at colonization contrasted embarrassingly with the glories of the Spanish Empire, whose profits were fabulously enriching Spain. Then Philip II of Spain, self-anointed foe of the Protestant Reformation, used part of his imperial gains to amass an invincible armada of ships for an invasion of England. The showdown came in 1588, when the lumbering Spanish flotilla, 130 strong, sailed into the English Channel. The English sea dogs fought back. Using craft that were swifter, more maneuverable, and more ably manned, they inflicted heavy damage on the cumbersome, overladen Spanish ships. Then a devastating storm arose, scattering the crippled Spanish fleet. The rout of the Spanish Armada marked the beginning of the end of Spanish imperial dreams, though Spain's New World Empire would not fully collapse for 3 more centuries. Within a few decades, much of the Spanish Caribbean would slip from Spain's grasp. Bloated by Peruvian and Mexican silver and convinced of its own invincibility, Spain had overreached itself, sowing the seeds of its own decline. England's victory over the Spanish Armada dampened Spain's fighting spirit, and helped ensure England's naval dominance in the North Atlantic. It started England on its way to becoming master of the world's oceans, a fact of enormous importance to the American people. England now had many of the characteristics that Spain displayed on the eve of its colonizing adventure a century earlier: a strong, unified national state under a popular monarch, a measure of religious unity after a protracted struggle between Protestants and Catholics, and a vibrant sense of nationalism and national destiny. A wondrous flowering of the English national spirit bloomed in the wake of the Spanish Armada's defeat. A golden age of literature dawned in this exhilarating atmosphere, with Shakespeare at its forefront, making occasional poetical references to England's American colonies. The English were seized with restlessness, with thirst for adventure, and with curiosity about the unknown. Everywhere, there blossomed a new spirit of self-confidence, of vibrant patriotism, and of boundless faith in the future of the English nation. When England and Spain finally signed a treaty of peace in 1604, the English people were poised to plunge headlong into the planting of their own colonial empire in the New World. Joining us today to discuss England on the eve of empire is our Historytellers correspondent, James Marshall.
England was poised and ready. As the 17th century opened, England throbbed with social and economic change. Its population was mushrooming, from some 3 million people in 1550 to about 4 million in 1600. In the English countryside, landlords were enclosing croplands for sheep grazing, forcing many small farmers into precarious tenancy or off the land altogether. It was no accident that the wool districts of eastern and western England, where Puritanism had taken strong root, supplied many of the earliest immigrants to America. When economic depression hit the woolen trade in the late 1500s, thousands of farmers took to the roads. They drifted about England, chronically unemployed, often ending up as beggars and paupers in cities like Bristol and London. This remarkably mobile population alarmed many contemporaries. They concluded that England was burdened with a surplus population. At the same time, laws of primogeniture decreed that only the eldest sons were eligible to inherit landed estates. Landholders' ambitious younger sons, among them Gilbert, Raleigh, and Drake, were forced to seek their fortunes elsewhere. But by the early 1600s, the joint stock company, forerunner of the modern corporation, was perfected. It enabled a considerable number of investors, called adventurers, to pool together enormous amounts of capital for a specific opportunity. Peace with Spain provided the opportunity for English colonization, while population growth provided the workers. Unemployment, as well as a thirst for adventure, for markets and for religious freedom, provided the motives. Finally, the joint stock companies provided the financial means. The stage was now set for a historic effort to establish an English beachhead in the still uncharted North American wilderness. For the Historytellers, I'm James Marshall.
It didn't take long for England to fully invest itself in the New World. In 1606, 2 years after peace with Spain, the hand of destiny beckoned toward Virginia. A joint stock company, known as the Virginia Company of London, received a charter from King James I of England for a settlement in the New World. The main attraction was the promise of gold, combined with a strong desire to find a passage through America to the Indies. Like most joint stock companies of the day, the Virginia Company was intended to endure for only a few years, after which its stockholders hoped to liquidate it for a profit. This arrangement put severe pressure on the luckless colonists, who were threatened with abandonment in the wilderness if they did not quickly strike it rich on the company's behalf. Few of the investors thought in terms of long-term colonization. However, the Charter of the Virginia Company is a significant document in American history, because it guaranteed to the overseas settlers the same rights of Englishmen that they would have enjoyed had they stayed at home. This precious boon was gradually extended to subsequent English colonies, helping to reinforce the colonists' sense that even on the far shores of the Atlantic, they remained comfortably within the embrace of traditional English institutions. But ironically, a century and a half later, colonial insistence on the rights of Englishmen fed the hot resentment of the colonists against an increasingly meddlesome mother country and nourished their appetite for independence. Setting sail in late 1606, the Virginia Company's 3 ships landed near the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, where Indians promptly attacked them. Pushing on up the bay, the tiny band of colonists eventually chose a location on the wooded and malaria-ridden banks of the James River, named in honor of King James I. The site was easy to defend, but it was mosquito-infested and devastatingly unhealthy. There, on May 24, 1607, about 100 English settlers, all of them men, disembarked. They called the place Jamestown. The early years of Jamestown proved a nightmare for all concerned, except the buzzards. 40 would-be colonists perished during the initial voyage in 1606. Another expedition in 1609 lost its leaders and many of its precious supplies in a shipwreck off Bermuda. Once ashore in Virginia, the settlers died by the dozens from disease, malnutrition, and starvation. Ironically, the woods rustled with game and the rivers flopped with fish, but the greenhorn settlers, many of them self-styled gentlemen unaccustomed to fending for themselves, wasted valuable time grubbing for non-existent gold when they should have been gathering provisions. Virginia was saved from utter collapse at the start, largely by the leadership and resourcefulness of Captain John Smith. Taking over in 1608, he whipped the gold-hungry colonists into line with a rule: he who shall not work, shall not eat. He had been kidnapped in December 1607 and subjected to a mock execution by the Indian chieftain Powhatan. And historians argue whether Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, had saved Smith by dramatically interposing her head between his and the war clubs of his captors. The symbolism of this ritual was apparently intended to impress Smith with Powhatan's power and with the Indians' desire for peaceful relations with the Virginians. Whatever the case, Pocahontas became an intermediary between the Indians and the settlers, helping to preserve a shaky peace, and to provide needed food stores. Still, the colonists died in droves, and living skeletons were driven to desperate acts. They were reduced to eating dogs, cats, rats, and mice, and even to digging up corpses for food. One hungry man killed, salted, and ate his wife. Apparently that was a step too far and he was promptly executed. Of the 400 settlers who managed to make it to Virginia by 1609, only 60 survived the winter of 1609 and 1610. Diseased and despairing, the remaining colonists dragged themselves aboard homeward-bound ships in the spring of 1610. They were met at the mouth of the James River by a long-awaited relief party, headed by a new governor, Lord De La Warr. He ordered the settlers back to Jamestown, imposed a harsh military regime on the colony, and soon undertook aggressive military action against the Indians. Disease, however, continued to reap a gruesome toll among the Virginians. By 1625 Virginia contained about 1,200 hard-bitten survivors, of the nearly 8,000 adventurers who had tried to start a new life in the ill-fated colony. This concludes Part 1 of the Planting of English America. In Part 2 we'll investigate the cultural clashes between the Native American peoples and the English colonists. Remember, history is not a lecture to be heard, but a story to be told. For the Historytellers, I'm Jason Calvert. Good night.